Welcome to our continuing shir in the halachos of Basar b'chalav. We are continuing our discussion of Yoreh Deah 87, 2, 3, and 4. In our previous class, we were discussing which types of meat were included in the Torah prohibition of meat, and we're going to expand on that further by saying, now that we've created which classes of meat are prohibited by Torah law, what about if the status of that meat is something that is impacted by other laws in the Torah? So we're going to talk about tonight is meat that is either prohibited because of the rule of nevela, the rule of treifa, and also part of the animal is prohibited because it is chelev. It's still from the animal, but it is a category of forbidden fat. Okay, and those things are cooked with milk. What is the rule with that? So the Gemara is the original progenitor of the question. Let's go back to the Gemara again. So we're back in Chulin, in Kuf Yud Gimel Beis, which is 113b. And the Gemara quotes Shmuel that says that it's a gedi, which is to include even the fat. So a gedi being a land mammal, it naturally has meat and it has fat in it. And so he says that includes its fat, and gedi also includes the hadai, which is to include all these categories. So what does this mean? So Rashi asked the question. So he says, what do the words mean? The rabos es chelev. So he means that when you went and cooked chelev, this forbidden fat, with the milk, and now you eat that mixture, because they're going to mix together, obviously, as a liquid, you're violating this prohibition of chelev, and you're violating the other prohibition of basar b'chalav. So you're violating eating forbidden fat, assuming you have enough of it, and you're violating basar b'chalav because both of those prohibitions are now applied to the same piece of food. And now we're also going to include a mesa. What's a mesa? So Rashi explains that if you cook the meat of an animal that dies on its own in milk, and you eat them, you're violating basar b'chalav, and he doesn't say it, but you're also violating nevela as well. Okay, so that's kind of like left unsaid, so similar to chelev. But then he adds, even though we normally say that one prohibition doesn't apply on top of an additional prohibition, you can't stack prohibitions. This is known as isur chal al isur. We normally don't do that. The kan hare kadmu isur chelev isur nevela isur basar b'chalav, and in both of these situations, the prohibition of forbidden fat and the prohibition of forbidden meat because it died, you didn't do shrita to it, the pasuk comes to include them. Okay, so Rashi says that this is the big novelty of Shmuel's statement. So the Gemara continues. You might want to say, maybe Shmuel holds that this doesn't work. Isser chal isser. Okay, so that's why he said the Torah specifically includes it, because normally this rule does work, and this is an exception to that rule. All right, so let's look at another statement that was said by other Amoraim. If you cook chelev with chalav, right, you cook forbidden fat in kosher milk. Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Asi. So they had a disagreement. One of them says you get lashes, and the other one says you do not get lashes. So how does this work? It says, so say maybe this is the dispute. One says that you are getting lashes is because the two prohibitions attach one to the other, and so when you eat them together, that's when the violation occurs, and so therefore the Torah prohibits it, and also holds you accountable by giving you lashes. One who says the lashes are not applied to you as a prohibition, they say that the prohibition does not attach one to the other. Okay, which we'll have to come back and explain that in more detail. We'll get to the Rashi in a second. No, everyone agrees that we don't stack prohibitions one on top of the other. But that applies to eating. Everyone agrees that you don't get lashes in a case situation where it was the eating alone. When they disagree is where they cook it. The cooking has a separate prohibition. When we say you were getting lashes, we're saying that's one prohibition. And when it says there is no lashes, we're saying that the Torah was telling me that cooking and eating are done through the vice of cooking. And so therefore, since you cannot be held accountable for the eating by cooking it together, you can't be held accountable for the cooking either. Okay? So the Gemara is basically going back and forth and saying that since these prohibitions aren't really stated explicitly, I might not be able to bring somebody before the court, testify that they ate prohibited fat cooked in milk in order to say that they are liable for the prohibition of having eaten basar b'chalav. Okay? So Rashi goes into this and he says, oh wait, I'm sorry, one more thing. Some people explain it differently, that it's talking about the cooking, that everyone agrees that they do get lashes, okay, for cooking it, but they disagree about eating it. So one who says that you don't get a penalty for eating it, it's because we say this general rule of Isser Chala Isser, okay, that prohibitions don't stack. And one who says you do get lashes, so he says, no, this is a special thing by Basar b'chalav, since it doesn't state eating in there, it's understood through the language of cooking. And so therefore, since you only get attached the prohibition to cooking, you are also attached to the prohibition for eating as well. And the third possible is maybe they each were saying something different and not actually talking about the same thing at all. So then Rashi says, let's go through this. So the fat and all the other prohibitions that we've been talking about were not prohibited in a cooking of basar b'chalav, meaning it was only limited to kosher foods, meaning kosher meat and kosher milk. That's where the prohibition attaches. So there's no prohibition of cooking basar b'chalav, and the things themselves are already prohibited. And in the second case, where we say that the lashes attached to cooking, and that's one type of prohibition, and they're attached to both of them. So when we say that you are not getting lashes, it's only talking about getting lashes for eating. But if you cook them, fine. And also you also specifically can only hold them liable when you say to them you're not allowed to cook it, you're not allowed to eat it. But if you say you're not allowed to eat it and says because of basar b'chalav, well then he's not liable for the consumption of chaylev, because you only warned him about the basar b'chalav. So therefore, they're not one and the same for that reason. And that's because basar b'chalav doesn't attach to the prohibition of chaylev. So this is a technical issue that is attached to whether or not you could give him lashes in court. But the thing, at the end of the day, is still prohibited. So this is only about whether or not you can give him lashes or not. It's still Torah prohibition. So the Rambam brings down the halacha in the following way. If you cook basar b'chalav, when the meat is from an animal that died on its own, not through shechita, or you're cooking it with the forbidden fat, with chaylev, okay, and you cook them with kosher milk, you are held liable for cooking them together, but you are not liable for eating them if you are warned about the prohibition being basar b'chalav. Because the prohibition of basar b'chalav is not attaching to nevela and chaylev. Right? Those are separate prohibitions. You can't eat an animal that died on its own, and you can't eat the forbidden fat, even if it's been properly slaughtered. Okay? Because the only time when we do that is when there's an overall prohibition that generalizes and includes it, or there's an additional prohibition. Okay? And also, the prohibitions have to come at the same time. So the Rambam and pretty much all Rishonim learn the same way, that the Gemara that says that there is a prohibition to cook basar b'chalav even when the animal meat itself is not kosher, this is pretty standard. And also when the animal dies because it's been attacked, right? So it's a treifa, okay, or it has some puncture somewhere in the body or some rip, okay? So these are Torah prohibitions from cooking them. And cooking them and being warned about it by witnesses would make you liable to lashes. But eating them and being warned about that would not make you liable to lashes, even though it's still prohibited, because of this general rule in legal precedence and testimony that I can't say that one prohibition stacks on top of another prohibition. Okay? So bishul is different because the Torah made a special inclusion for it. Now that we've said that the Isser bishul applies to it, let's say you cook it. All right, is there a prohibition of hana? So this is again something above and beyond your normal food products, which is that you're not allowed to benefit from it. And we said we said back when we did our class on Sif Aleph that Isser hana means you cannot benefit from it. So I can't sell it to a non-Jew, I can't feed it to an animal. So, but if I have a treifa, right? If I did something wrong with if the animal got attacked by another animal and it died, I could feed that to the local dogs. I could turn it into cat food. I could do all kinds of stuff with it. But can I do that in this case? So the Pri Megadim asks this question, and he seems to say that yes, that's what it seems to be. Okay, that seems to be the case. The only sticking point is that the Rambam makes a statement in the Parish of Mishnayos. He says that by benefit, we say ein iser chala iser. So this general rule of attaching it, iser hana, sits outside of that, and so by the bishul of prohibited meat and the kosher milk, that's a separate prohibition. But if I benefit from it, that's not a Torah prohibition. Okay, so that doesn't seem to attach. Okay, because it seems to be that the attachment of hana has to also attach with achila. Those two are related. Okay, so what does this mean? So it means it's kind of cute. So Deah Marvava says that if you rely on this Rambam in the Parish Mishnayos, that's okay. So what does that mean? Let's say someone hands you a McDonald's cheeseburger. Okay. Right? Well, you know it's not kosher, but they roast it on the grill with the cheese and the meat, and they're both treif, right? So can you feed it to your dog or not? So the Deah Marvava says, if my dog is in great need, I could give it to the dog, even though there seems to be an Isser hana going to everybody. Okay? However, the Pri Megadim and the Chassam Sofer are both in agreement that this is a Torah prohibition. So, yesh v'yesh. Okay? There's this way, there's that way. Now, next thing to look about. Okay, so this Rambam, if there is a prohibition of hana, okay? So we say that we want to know whether or not you can, let's say, feed it to an animal or sell it to a non-Jew. Okay? Now, is there an Isser prohibition? Is there an Isser hana that prohibits the milk that was cooked with meat that was treif and nevela? Okay? So let's look at this Chassam Sofer for a second. So the Chassam Sofer looks into this Rambam's opinion, where he says that it's permitted. Okay, so he wants to know, is the milk also permitted? Okay, that's what it seems to be. And his argument is that when the Gemara says that by including a goat, okay, and not including chelev, okay, what it's trying to say is that when you have half of this and half of that, they don't add up together to make one Isser, right? We said there's a minimum share of Isser, which is a kazayas. So if you take half a zayas and half a zayas, they won't add up together. Okay. So some people also argue, and he's also arguing that some people say that eating it is a problem because half of it is nevela and the other half is, but cooking won't prohibit it. Okay. So then you have to ask the question the other way is, where would I be chayiv on the milk? How would I if I just consume the milk and not the meat? Okay, so really what we're saying is that maybe the milk should be prohibited, and so the Chassam Sofer learns from the Gemara that the prohibition really goes on the meat. Okay, yeah, but if there's no prohibition in the meat, there's no prohibition on the milk. So therefore, in tiny amounts, it may not be a problem. So that's the Chassam Sofer. So what that would mean is in our example of a cheeseburger, if you had a situation where that you took off the cheese, okay, and the dog wanted to just eat the rest of the non-kosher beef patty, you might be okay with that as long as you give him less than a kazayas each time. okay, because it wouldn't add up to each other, and also that's what seems to be fit. But otherwise, according to Chassam Sofer himself, according to the way he's explaining the Rambam, Chassam Sofer himself would prohibit it, but just according to this Rambam's opinion. Chazon Ish explains the Rambam in the following way. He says that it's possible that you're not violating Basar b'chalav when you're eating them one on top of the other, right? I just gave the cheeseburger example, okay? And when the flavors are mixed together, okay, that's a new flavor, and that flavor essentially, that flavor essentially doesn't go into the milk in the same way it goes into the meat. Okay? So that's why he's saying it's something different. Okay, so that's entirely, that could be an entirely interesting reason why this Rambam is lenient like this. Okay. Now let's look at one other interesting thing over here. Okay, let's go look at how the Mechaber and the Ramah Paskin as this relates to us. So we saw in Sif Gimel that we said this law of Basar B'chalav only applies if you have Basar Behema Tahara and Chalav Behema Tahara. Okay, so that's what we say there. But by when it's kosher meat and treif milk, right? You get your milk from a camel, or it's treif meat and it's kosher milk, so the milk comes from the cow, but you get the meat from a camel. So therefore, the Torah didn't extend the prohibition to that. And then we also said in the same halacha that a deer and a bird, right? They're mutter by cooking and benefiting from Torah laws, and their prohibition on eating is only a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, so we said all of that before. The Ramah adds. So the Ramah adds nothing, right? Just yet. The Shulchan Aruch seems to point out from here that we want nevela. That we want tameya. That has to be a non-kosher species, like I mentioned, camel. But he doesn't specify nevela and treifa, which is going to have an iser basar b'chalav from the Torah. Okay. So that seems to not be in accordance with the Rambam's opinion. That's what the language seems to imply. So let's take a look in great detail about their language. Okay, so there's an interesting diuk in this. Okay, he says there's a pre-Toar. He says the following. Okay. So he says that there's a case. There's a case that came for the Maharam Shif. So the pre-Toar is quoting a Maharam Shif, and he says that there was a liver from an animal that was roasted in fat. Yeah, it was roasted in fat, and then it was fried in butter. Okay? And so the Maharam Shif over there wants to argue that because you didn't properly kosher it, you left the blood inside of it. It's mostly blood inside of the liver. Okay? And he says, therefore, that in that case, it would not be asher b'hana. Okay? That's the pre-Toar. And so the Pri Megadim got a hold of this, and he says this is unreliable. Okay? This was only written, even though the pre-Toar brings it down, it was only written as a thought, but not as a final decision. Okay. So the Degel Mervava also makes a note over here by Basar Tahora and Chalav Tameya. So he makes a note, and he says that Basar Nevela and Chalev, you cannot cook them with milk by Torah law, and you are held liable on their cooking. But by eating, their prohibition is not from the prohibition of Basar B'chalav. And this comes straight from the Rambam we talked about at the beginning of our discussion this evening. He says, however, it's not clear that there's a prohibition on benefiting from the Rambam. And so therefore, in the Parish HaMishnaos that we discussed, we discover that there is reason to be lenient in that case. Now, however, we do find that Tosfos would disagree with the assessment of the Rambam. So the Rambam talked about being an Isser Kolel. So Tosfos seems to imply that Isser Mosif is not. They would not agree with the Rambam's assessment of that this is not an additional prohibition, which technically would apply in this case. Okay? However, that's just in theory, because they seem to learn Mosif a little bit differently. Mosif could apply, but since Tosfos themselves don't actually say that it does apply, there's no reason to say it in their name when they don't specifically say it. And so therefore, he seems to say that even the shot in the Mechaber is to be lenient in these cases. Okay? So, but as we pointed out, the Pri Megadim and the Chassam Sofer didn't like that. Okay? Now let's look now here at the second part of this same Mechaber. Now we talked about Nevela and Shrefa. So we say that by fish and by locusts, there's not even rabbinic prohibitions. Okay? So the Taz makes an interesting statement about the Chagav, okay? And this statement of the Taz is actually not found in our Sugya. It's found in Siman Pei Hey, okay, which is the rules of Chagavim. He says, nowadays, we don't eat them. Okay? So he says that's just generally how it is. So he brings down that the minhag is no longer to eat them. So he says that. There are those whom I have met amongst other communities who do have a Masorah to eat them, and so therefore they could continue to eat them. Okay. Now, the Ramah says that, so we say the reason why the chicken and stuff is prohibited is because of a Maris Ayin thing. So the Ramah attaches some laws of Maris Ayin, which we talked a little bit about last week. So he says that we make milk from almonds, okay? And we cook the chicken in the almond milk, okay? But we don't have to do anything about that because it's only rabbinic. That's why he's attaching this law over here on this mechaber. But if it's beef, you have to put some nuts in there because it's on Issa D'Oraisa otherwise. So the Ramah seems to imply that if things are Issa D'Rabbanan, I'm not worried about Maris Ayin. So the Shach does not like this logical approach. Okay, so he seems to say that he doesn't agree with this because, as we had mentioned when we started looking at this halacha last week, that it's not appropriate to take this leniency because we have a prohibition mentioned earlier, which we mentioned was in Samach Gimel, that if you're going to drink the blood from fish, whatever the liquid is inside fish, there needs to be scales in there so people don't think you're drinking a prohibited substance. Okay? So therefore people should think that it is prohibited. Okay? And cooking it together where there's also no Torah prohibition, that would actually be okay to not leave the nuts in there. The nuts are for later when you're serving it. Okay? Now, that's according to the Ramah. The Shach then brings down the Marshal, who says that from the case of the blood of fish, that in these situations, we actually do require you to do them and to put the nuts in and around them. Okay? And especially with chicken. Okay? So that people shouldn't think that you are having meat with milk and chicken with milk, that you shouldn't even be violating a rabbinic prohibition. And also he says so people shouldn't think we pass and like Rabbi Yosef Lili. Okay, so he says that. So those are his words. Okay, and that's what the Shach settles on. So just a bunch of interesting laws that we've learned. Okay, so even though the Ramah number one is lenient, we are saying that we're going to be strict like the Marshal. So number one, we learned that there's a machlokes about when you cook nevela and treifa in milk. Okay, so an animal that dies either because it died on its own, or because he messed up a shechita, or because it got attacked by a wild animal. Torah prohibits that. So we want to know in the Gemara whether or not there is a prohibition on cooking. So there's a bunch of flopping back and forth in the Gemara. Okay, it seems to be that everyone agrees that the cooking is a problem. The question is whether or not you're going to add on a prohibition of eating and have two prohibitions of eating. One prohibition because it's, let's say, nevela, and a second prohibition because you cooked it with milk and made it into basar b'chalav. And so therefore, if people testified against you in court to get you lashes, they said, we warned him against eating basar b'chalav, and he ate it anyway. Okay, but the meat was nevela. Oh, we still apply that. Do we apply that? Okay. So that's what we say. So how do we paskin regarding this? Because the Gemara seems to not sound like that's the case. So the Rambam and all the Rishonim all say that there is a prohibition on cooking them together, and therefore if they were warned about cooking basar b'chalav together, they would get lashes. Okay, and that's even when the animal meat is from a treifa or a nevela. Okay, so you get treif cow meat, or you get nevela goat meat, and you cook it with milk. And we warn you, you get lashes if we testify against you in court. Okay, or we testify about you cooking kosher meat, right? You go to your local grocery store with the glatt kosher beef patties, and you go and you take milk that was milk from a treif cow. How do you get a treif cow? Stab it in the stomach or something, right? And it's still alive, but it's making milk. Okay, so a puncture wound in the stomach that empties out to the outside with that type of thing would be an example of a treif one. And so too, if you took the treif of this and the treif of that, right? So it's like double treif. You're gonna make double treif bishul problems. So you double treifed up everything. So those are all Torah prohibition because the cooking is a problem. But if they testify in court against you because of the eating, okay, well, we all seem to agree to some degree that there's no isser chalal isser. Okay, so but bishul was included by everything else. We saw that there's a three-way disagreement about whether there's a prohibition of a benefit, an isser hana. Okay, so the Pri Megadim says that there is one, and Deah Mubava points out that there's a Rambam who says that there is not one. Okay, and also the Chassam Sofer held that way. And we also talked about if you cook half of meat, half of milk, is there you get a full prohibition about the milk? So we said that if you eat one without the other, okay, they're not excluded except for tmeya, okay, when it's not a kosher animal at all, but not nevela and treifa. Okay, so when you have half one and half of the other, and even though we said there's no isser chalal isser, nonetheless the prohibition of basar b'chalav will attach itself to nevela and treifa even of tiny amounts. Okay. And we also say that we also attach an isser hana on any amount of basar, any amount of basar nevela and treifa that is cooked with milk, either milk of kosher milk or treifa or nevela milk. The final thing that we also talked about is that the Ramah says that one could be lenient about maris ayin, that people don't, that if you want to serve parve milk with the chicken on the table, that's okay, but not with beef because that touches on maris ayin of a Torah prohibition, and that's not something we want to stick our head involve it with that. However, the Marashal says no, that you would be misleading people even in a case of where you have almond milk or some other parve milk that's sitting with chicken, because people might make the mistake to think that we hold like Rabbi Yossi Aglili, whose name we mentioned in last week's shir, and think that it's okay to have something like chicken parmesan. God forbid. We don't want people to think that. That's not appropriate. Okay? So that is concluding our shir for tonight on these halachas. We are going to talk more about maris ayin next time. no reason to make this one share extremely long, but we'll discuss more about Maris Ayin and understand better about which things are prohibited, and continue our discussion of these 3 halachos. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating. Have a wonderful day.